The wind howled across the barren plains of the frontier, carrying with it the dry sting of desert dust and the faint echo of hoofbeats long faded into memory. Out here, survival was not promised, it was wrestled daily from a land that offered little mercy. Amid this unforgiving expanse stood a lonely homestead, its wooden walls weather-beaten but strong, a testament to the man and woman who had built it with their own calloused hands. That man was Thomas Whitlock, a former Union soldier turned rancher, and beside him was his wife, Clara, a quiet but unyielding woman whose resilience had seen them through droughts, raids, and endless toil. Together they had carved out a life on the edge of the New Mexico territory, raising 2 children under the constant shadow of outlaw violence and lawless nights. Yet despite the danger, Clara had always believed their home was more than a patch of land. It was a promise of a better future, a piece of stability carved from chaos. But fate had other plans, and on a night when the stars burned low and the air itself seemed heavy with foreboding, that fragile dream shattered. The Whitlocks had just finished supper, the laughter of their children mingling with the soft crackle of the fire, when the silence of the prairie was broken by the thunder of approaching horses. Before Thomas could reach for his rifle, the door exploded inward, splintering under the boots of a gang of 12 men, the notorious Vargas brothers and their band of cutthroats. They came with faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, eyes glinting with greed and malice, the smell of whiskey and blood already clinging to them. What followed was chaos, shouts, gunfire, the screams of children. Thomas fought bravely, managing to cut down 2 men before a bullet found his chest, sending him crashing to the floorboards. Clara, dragged into the corner, could only watch in horror as her children were torn from her arms, their cries silenced by ruthless hands. By the time the smoke cleared and the gang rode off into the black of night, the house lay in ruins, blood staining the wooden floor. Clara was left alive, but only to endure the torment of loss. And in that moment, beneath the shattered beams of her home, grief hardened into something far sharper. Clara Whitlock buried her husband and children with her own trembling hands at the break of dawn, the rising sun casting long shadows across the freshly dug earth. She stood alone at the graves, her dress torn, her face streaked with soot and tears, but her eyes, once soft with kindness, now burned with a cold fire. Neighbors came from distant ranches when word spread of the massacre, offering sympathy, food, and hollow promises of justice. The nearest sheriff, however, admitted what Clara already knew: the Vargas gang was too strong, too feared, and too quick to disappear into the desert. No posse would form, no lawman would chase them, not when half the county lay under their thumb. For most, the matter was closed, another tragedy in a land that devoured families whole. But Clara was not most. The widow who once sang to her children at night now walked the silent halls of her ruined home with a revolver in her hand, whispering oaths of vengeance into the darkness. Weeks passed, and with them, the softness of grief hardened into iron resolve. She began to prepare, learning to shoot with both hands, riding long hours until the horse and saddle felt like extensions of her own body. She spoke little, her silence mistaken for mourning, but in truth she was studying, listening, gathering every whispered tale of the Vargas gang's whereabouts. Nights were spent sharpening blades, oiling her rifle, and tracing old maps by lantern light. And when she finally stepped out of that homestead, clad in black and armed to the teeth, she was no longer Clara Whitlock, the rancher's wife. She had become something else entirely, the widow of the plains, a figure of grim determination who would trade her sorrow for blood. Her quest was not for justice in the eyes of men, nor mercy in the eyes of God. It was for retribution, carved one bullet at a time into the men who had taken everything from her. Clara's journey into the lawless heart of the frontier began not with fanfare but with silence, the kind of silence that follows death and lingers long after the gunsmoke clears. She rode out from her homestead beneath a pale sky, the horizon stretched endlessly before her, as though daring her to turn back. But she never did. Every mile between her and her ruined home seemed to strip away the remnants of the woman she once was, leaving behind only the shadow of vengeance. Her first stop was a crumbling trading post at the edge of the Rio Grande, a place where travelers whispered news of outlaw movements between sips of bitter coffee. She entered, her black dress billowing like a storm cloud, and the room fell quiet. Men who had seen killers, thieves, and broken souls all paused at the sight of a woman carrying death in her eyes. She asked no favors, only questions, her voice low but sharp, slicing through the smoky air. Rumors told of the Vargas gang hiding in canyons, raiding silver shipments, leaving trails of ash and bone behind them. To others, these were warnings. To Clara, they were directions. Nights bled into days as she tracked them across the vast desert, her revolvers growing more familiar than her own reflection. She learned to shoot in darkness, to move silently where even coyotes dared not tread, and to steel her body against hunger and exhaustion. Each town she passed through whispered her name, not as Clara Whitlock but as the widow, the woman who hunted killers alone. Children peeked from behind saloon doors to catch a glimpse of her, while drifters raised their glasses in respect or fear. Yet she spoke to none of them, her heart chained to the graves she had left behind. One evening, outside a border town where the Vargas brothers were said to have passed, she finally tasted blood. A drunken outlaw, one of their men, boasted of the widow's husband, shot down like a dog, laughing as he spilled whiskey on the floor. Clara stepped out of the shadows and put a single bullet between his eyes before he could even finish his laugh. The saloon froze, glasses trembling in men's hands, until she holstered her weapon and walked back into the night, leaving behind only silence and fear. From that night on, her legend was no longer rumor. It was fact, and the Vargas gang began to hear whispers of a woman who would not rest until she had carved their names into the dirt with her bullets. By the time Clara reached the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, her reputation rode ahead of her like thunder. Outlaws who once swaggered into towns now flinched at shadows, fearing they might reveal the silhouette of a widow cloaked in black. The Vargas gang, once untouchable, grew restless as their numbers dwindled. Clara was no longer hunting, she was dismantling, cutting away at their strength piece by piece. She ambushed supply wagons, slaughtered lookouts in their sleep, and left calling cards of vengeance nailed to saloon doors, a single bullet wrapped in black cloth. Each death carried the weight of her family's screams, and with each man she felled, she whispered the names of her husband and children, as if their spirits guided her aim. Yet vengeance is a hunger that consumes, and Clara felt its claws dig deeper into her soul. Sleep became haunted by dreams of her children calling from the darkness, their voices drowned out by gunfire. Still, she pressed on, because she knew the end lay ahead, and it wore the faces of the Vargas brothers. The final approach came on a storm-racked night when the gang holed up in a canyon stronghold, their campfires flickering against jagged stone walls. Clara descended upon them like judgment itself. The first shots cracked through the rain, echoing like thunderclaps, and men dropped before they even knew what hunted them. Chaos erupted as torches were overturned, horses screamed, and the storm above seemed to roar in approval. Clara moved through it all with relentless precision, a phantom in the rain, her revolvers spitting fire with every pull of the trigger. Outlaws begged, some tried to flee, others fought desperately, but none escaped. One by one they fell, until only the Vargas brothers remained, their eyes wide not with fear of death, but with the dawning realization that their sins had summoned something worse than justice. When she finally stood before them, soaked in rain and blood, Clara did not tremble. She raised her weapon with hands steady as stone, the same hands that had once cradled children, now delivering the final judgment. And with each shot, the screams of that night at her homestead were avenged. When the storm broke, silence fell upon the canyon, not the silence of peace, but the silence of endings. The storm had settled into the desert like a curse, its winds dying but its silence heavier than any thunder. In the aftermath of blood and gunfire, Maria stood at the edge of the canyon where the final outlaw had fallen. Her revolver hung loose at her side, smoke still curling from the barrel, the metallic scent of spent powder lingering in the air like a ghost. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on her chest seemed lighter, though her heart still bore the scars of what had been taken from her. She looked down at her trembling hands, not from fear but from the raw violence she had unleashed, violence she once thought herself incapable of. The outlaw gang that had burned her home, slaughtered her husband, and left her child in the dust was no more. Every one of them had paid in blood. Yet victory did not taste sweet, it was bitter, like desert ash. Maria knelt on the cold stone ground, her breath unsteady, and whispered her family's names into the canyon winds, as if their spirits might hear her. She had become something more than a widow, something darker and sharper, the desert's reckoning. And though her enemies were gone, she knew the West was never truly free of men like them. Somewhere out there, more wolves waited to prey on the innocent. Maria rose slowly, holstering her revolver with quiet resolve. Her war might be finished, but her fight was not. The widow had carved her place into the lore of the frontier, and her story would not end in silence. And so, under the burning red sky of the Old West, Maria's tale became a whisper carried across saloons and dusty trails. Some spoke of her as a ghost, others as a legend, the widow who took revenge. But to those who heard her story, she was something far more powerful, a warning that even in a land ruled by violence and greed, justice could still rise, dressed in black, armed with nothing but courage and a steady hand. The West had taken everything from her, yet in her grief, she became the very spirit of vengeance. And as long as the desert winds carried her name, no outlaw would ever sleep soundly again.